Indiana Disability History Project, Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Indiana University.
All right, my name is Rick Edwards. I'm currently the Director of Safety and ADA Compliance for the Department of Natural Resources, and I'm also the Chairperson of ADA Indiana, the steering committee in Indiana, responsible for implementation, promoting implementation of the ADA across Indiana. I joined the crowd in 1970 when I broke my neck as a result of a accident that I had in the back of a Volkswagen Beetle, and broke my neck, like I said, and wound up in using a wheelchair for, it's been too many years now to mention. I'm not going to do the giveaway of what my age is, but I'm going to be a grandfather here in a couple of weeks. ADA since it was being discussed in Congress, I've been a part of the discussion about the ADA and what it should be and what it means to people with disabilities. So I've had a lot of experience in the ADA and dealing with it. So it's been interesting dealing with the history and going from not having an ADA to having an ADA. So, do I need to readjust things, or are we in good shape?
I think we're okay.
Okay.
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about the early days of the ADA? Because it was passed in 1990, and you said you've kind of been involved since the 70s.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about the early days?
Right. Well, for example, back in 1970, when I went to going from high school, I was going to Culver Military Academy before my accident, and afterwards couldn't do that because of the marching and all that sort of thing involved. So I went to my high school in Spencer, which was not accessible. It was on 2 levels. And my dad, who was the school attorney, told the superintendent, yes, he would go back to school in Spencer. So they carried me up and down 2 sets of 10 steps each to get to my classes in the upper levels, and back down again at the end of the day. So much different with the passage of the ADA. Of course, not that everything was perfect after that, but it certainly changed the mindset of a lot of people about what their responsibilities were in terms of people with disabilities and how they were supposed to treat and react towards the issues that they had, the barriers that were there.
Do you remember any early rallies or any significant meetings?
One of my favorite stories involved Justin Dart, who was the father of the ADA, and this was when I was working as the state's ADA coordinator. We thought it would be a good idea to invite Justin to Indiana to speak to some of the people that were in Indiana just beginning to understand what the ADA was all about. And I had never met Justin Dart, so I didn't know anything about him but by his reputation. And I thought, well, here's a gentleman who, my goodness, was going to be just an amazing person and very outstanding and all that sort of thing. And so I'm sitting in the lobby of the hotel where we had invited Justin to come speak. And I'm looking around, keeping an eye out for him, and I see this gentleman coming down the hallway in what looked like a wheelchair that was right out of Goodwill, wearing this funny looking hat. And I thought, I better go take care of this guy and deal with him before Justin shows up. Well, it turned out it was Justin Dart, and I quickly found out that my flaws and my preconceived notions about people was quickly changed. He was very gracious, and he was definitely a character. I got to because I had a wheelchair-equipped van, lift-equipped van. I was able to take him around a couple of places, and we talked and got to know each other as well as you can in that short a period of time. And it was entertaining because not only did I get to hear a lot about what he had been dealing with, but we got to share the camaraderie and the understanding that This was not just a thing that was going to affect us. It was going to be a thing that was going to affect our kids and our kids' kids and many generations to follow. So what we were doing was vitally important, not only to us, but to our kids.
So once Justin got to Indiana,
Yeah.
tell me about the process and what he did to help Indiana kind of get on board with the ADA.
Sure. Well, once Justin was there, we sat down and we had town meetings where we actually heard from a number of different people in a lot of different communities what the issues were, what was bothering them, were some of the problems and barriers that they were dealing with. And basically that is what developed the ADA, was hearing that people were having problems with employment, Title I. They were having problems with transportation, Title II. They were having problems in their local stores, Title III. State and local governments were creating barriers for them. So all of those stories that we heard laid the groundwork and the foundation for the ADA itself. And so we were able to not only hear from people as to what the real problems were, but we were able to put that into an act and actually try and address some of those questions, some of those problems, and remove some of those barriers.
You're doing a great job. I'm not having to ask you much of that.
Thanks.
So when Justin got here and you had these meetings, you talked to people that would benefit from the ADA. Did you talk to other government officials or other people that were really involved and significant in helping with this movement?
Right. Because of Justin's stature and his position in government, we were able to get hold of some of the folks that were the policy makers, some of the movers and shakers, and say, here's an individual who was appointed by presidents, and an individual whose capabilities and expertise and just plain and simple desire was so great that they had no choice but to listen. And so he also instilled in me the ability to recognize that it's important to be at the table. In order for us to make a change, people with disabilities, not only do we have to have this act, but we also have to have the ability to communicate with those people and become those people that are making the changes and the decisions.
That's great. All right. Did you ever have a chance to meet any other strong advocates such as Senator Ted Kennedy or Senator Tom Harkin or Andy Jacobs?
I've been dealing with a lot of folks in my position. I've been privileged to be able to meet with some of those folks that were instigators in the ADA. Some of the ones locally that paved the way are the ones that I think are more important, frankly. The Jim and Frida Pauleys, the ones that were the ones battling before there was an ADA, the ones that laid the groundwork for us, that made it so much easier. When I went to Ball State, my alma mater, I broke down some barriers there with the disability community and was able to make some significant changes there. And it was kind of humorous. I went back a few years later after I graduated from Ball State and talked with Rich Harris, who was the disability coordinator there at Ball State. And he was kind of chuckling and saying, you'd really get a laugh out of this. They were complaining, the students were complaining about the lack of an accessible drinking fountain at the student center. And what was so funny about that was that we had such a struggle getting the administration to understand that we should have access into the student center. And now they're complaining about the fact that they couldn't get a drink there. It shows that we have come quite a ways. There are still lots of things that need to be done. We're not at all saying that we're in a utopia because we have the ADA. We have a lot of work that has to be done. We have a lot of things that, a lot of barriers that need to be removed. Most importantly, we have a lot of people that need to become more educated about what this is all about. Being a person with a disability is something that can happen to anybody, anytime, anywhere. Knows no sex, knows no race, knows no age. And so any one of us can become one of us at any time. And so that's why the ADA is so important to the whole world. It is something that is going to change minds as well as break down the barriers.
That's excellent.
Okay?
All right, well, there's some other questions. I kind of like where we're going.
Okay.
You know, I like the fact that you talk about there's more work to be done, and the fact that we've made some progress, and there's some other things that you'd like to see. Are there some things that you feel are right there that you feel need to be tackled first and foremost in terms of ADA?
Sure. Of course, right now in this day and age, 2009, everybody is struggling with employment. It's much more significant for people with disabilities just because you've got the additional barriers that employers have towards people with disabilities. They don't understand many times what people with disabilities can do. And so the ADA, and I've said this before, the ADA is really a tool that needs to be used correctly so that people with disabilities can get the jobs that they need and can remove the barriers that need to be removed. My biggest concern with the ADA is that it will be used incorrectly, and because of that, damage some of the work that's been done. I have a difficult time sometimes when people try and use the ADA as a club rather than a tool to encourage folks to understand what's necessary and what should be being done. Not to mention, or not to say rather, that the ADA can't be used as a club. It may sometimes have to be used as a club because there are people sometimes who just, for whatever reason, don't get it. And so it's good to have that arsenal there, but it shouldn't be abused. It should be, like I said, used in the correct way to try and get folks to understand. Again, you could be joining this group. A person with a disability is somebody who may or may not have had that disability their entire life, and so it's something that, again, I hope that the ADA is something that encourages people rather than beats people into submission.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a few of these formal questions that they have.
Okay.
And some of this you may have already addressed, and if you have, you can just, I guess,
Sure.
tell me that. Basically, one of the questions was, who was doing some of the important work in Indiana, basically getting the word out about ADA and talking with people and organizations, and I know you mentioned some of that.
Sure, Jim and Frida. Some of the people who have been involved in the ADA in Indiana, Jim and Frida Paula, even before the ADA was there. Of course, Sue Ellen Jackson Bonner has done a great deal of work, positive work. Christine and Paul and the whole crowd there at the Governor's Planning Council. The people who have been doing the work, there have been people with disabilities and people without disabilities. I think of Mayor Goldsmith and even our current governor making those inroads, not because they had anybody necessarily with a disability on their mind, but because they recognized that it was the right thing to do. I hate to mention people by name because there are so many times you'll forget so many of the folks. Of course, most recently we've lost Sharon Burkett, and she was a real advocate. There are people like Nancy Griffin, like Costa Miller. Oh golly, that you know, again, I hate to mention them because there are so many others that are not getting mentioned. Norton Brown, another name that people may not recognize, that's been around forever and making those changes before we even had an ADA.
How did people get organized, 20, 30 years ago? Did they use a calling tree? Did they, how without all the technology that we have now, how did people get organized?
Yeah, people got organized in the early years before the computers and the emails and all those sorts of things by using telephones, by like you mentioned, the calling trees. I can remember licking a lot of stamps and doing a lot of envelope stuffing and that sort of thing to try and get the word out about things, and making a lot of phone calls. I can remember, the ear getting so red and swollen that you had to switch ears. So, and by word of mouth. We had a lot of folks that would just simply, go to conferences like the Governor's Planning Council conference and just simply say, hey, this is something that's out there.
Okay. And do you remember the day the ADA was signed into law?
The day the ADA was signed into law, it was July 26, 1990, and I was not able to go to Washington, D.C. It was, however, something that swept across the country, especially for those people with disabilities. I think we recognized that this was something very significant. And of course, on the steps of the White House, or the lawn of the White House rather, when President Bush #1 signed the act into law, there were a lot of us that were watching on TV and enjoying that, wishing we had been able to be there, but recognizing that it was, again, something that was going to have an impact across the nation.
Okay, and then as we approach the 20th anniversary of the ADA, how would you describe the greatest accomplishments? And then you could follow that with what still needs to be done, and you've talked a little bit about that already.
As we're getting close to the signing, the 20th anniversary of the signing of the ADA, the most significant change has to be the mindset that has been changed, because that has much more of an impact than any kind of brick and mortar changes or programmatic changes, because that's where the whole problem starts, is in the minds of people. And so the ADA has been most valuable for changing some of those minds about people with disabilities in general. I can remember going to a grocery store one time with, I use a wheelchair, and of course going around the grocery store there are always lots of little kids. And I like little kids. I'm on their same level physically and mentally sometimes. So I enjoy little kids. There was a little boy that was walking with his mom, and he was seeing my chair, and of course it sticks out, and it's interesting to little kids. And he was kind of pulling on his mom and pointing, and I knew he wanted to ask a question. He's looking at me and asking, what's that? Why is he doing that? And the mom was just pulling him away, trying to get him to not even recognize that I was there, trying to move away, I don't know, because she thought it was rude or something like that. And I thought, oh shoot, you've got to let the kid ask these questions, because that's how he's going to learn. And I don't recall right now if that was before the ADA or after. I think it was after, but I thought that's one of the things that's most important about the ADA, is that it changed people's perceptions about asking somebody with a disability, is it okay if I open this door for you? Is it okay if, do you need some help doing whatever? Again, the ADA brings that to the fore and lets people feel a little more comfortable, be a little more ready to ask the questions. What can we do to remove a barrier? Is there a barrier here?
Recorded at the 2009 Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities Conference. Produced by Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, Center for Health Equity, funded in part by The Indiana Governor's Council for People with Disabilities. Copyright 2018, the Trustees of Indiana University.